Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the All Saints podcast. Funny thing happened this week. Received a message on the men's group chat here at All Saints, which went a little something like this. My wife and I were chatting and she mentioned how she has noticed some of the other All Saints ladies wear head coverings and some don't. That wasn't the funny bit. The funny bit was the opening greeting, which went, quote, "Quick question, gents." Yeah, I know. Hilarious. One thing that this isn't is a quick question, as the mound of papers in my head covering file and books on my head covering shelf will testify. Anyway, this is something I guess I should talk about. I don't think I've ever spoken about this publicly at All Saints. This is 1 Corinthians 11 from verse 2 onwards, really, although there's a bunch of other texts which are relevant. You might want to go away and read that. Yes, quite right. There are a number of ladies at All Saints. I would probably estimate about 10, maybe 12 who wear some kind of head covering or partial head covering during worship, and the vast majority don't. The majority of our officers' wives don't cover their heads during worship, but I think there's at least one who does. And as you can tell from my demeanour, this is not something where the issue itself is something that I'm going to get uptight about. I actually think that the status quo as it exists at All Saints right now, where, as far as I can make out, there is no squabbling and quarrelling over this issue, and there are a small number of ladies who believe it's appropriate to wear a head covering, or their husbands believe it's appropriate, and they've asked them to. The fact that a number of people do and others don't is completely fine. Not because matters of propriety and worship don't matter, but because it's not obvious to me that this is quite the simple issue that is sometimes presented. So I'm going to get to that in a second. I'm not going to try and cover all the material on this in one podcast because I don't want this one to go on for about 3 hours. I will, I think, return to it maybe next week and talk about the text in detail, or in a little bit more detail, at least, than I'm going to do now. What I want to do to begin with, though, is just to kind of clear the ground and cover some methodological questions and some questions about how we approach this issue, because I think how we approach it is, in this case, as important or even more important than the particular conclusion that people reach. Just a shortcut to verse 16 of chapter 11. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. Oh, goodness, scholars even debate what the practice Paul is referring to there is. But clearly this reflects his teaching elsewhere that he doesn't want people to be contentious, whether about this or anything else. So let me just clear the ground a little bit, make some methodological comments and some observations about how we should and shouldn't go about answering this question, and then we'll come to the scriptures maybe next week, maybe another time, we'll see. So here's a question. How do people respond in general to discussions about contentious issues, especially if they already have made their opinion known on those issues? The answer is, normally, the way that people respond to this, and this is not a criticism of Christians in particular, this is just an observation about how people respond to discussions of contentious matters, is they've already made their mind up about the issue, especially if it's something which is visible, like a public practice, like something you can see, covering your head in worship or whatever. And they're waiting for the speaker to either affirm or deny their view, and then on the basis of whether they discover the speaker agrees with them or disagrees with them, they will form an emotional posture towards the presentation the speaker has made. What they won't be doing normally is to listen to the actual arguments being made. That's a universal human trait. It has been documented in modern psychological literature, behavioral economics, and so on. Go and read Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, and all the stuff that comes out of that school of thought. And as Christians, we have an obligation to avoid that way of thinking. We have an obligation to listen to what Scripture says and to do the usual thing with our feelings about what Scripture says. We've got an obligation to hear the voice of God and change our intellectual and emotional posture in response to it. What that means in turn is that we've got to be very careful about a kind of reactionariness that can pervade discussions of this subject. For example, many of the contemporary writings on this subject are deeply worried about the cultural degeneration that is symbolized by and manifested in the growth of feminism and egalitarianism within formerly conservative churches, and associated secondarily with promiscuity and displays of more of one's body than one should, especially among ladies, but not only. And in that context, some people think of head coverings as a kind of recovery of the past, a former age of modesty and propriety in relation to women's dress. If women are exposing themselves in the culture, then maybe it's a good thing for Christian women to recover covering themselves or something. That's how the argument goes. Well, it may be right that our culture is becoming morally degenerate, and that's being manifested in how ladies uncover more of their bodies than they did in previous ages. That's certainly an observation that Calvin makes when he's talking about this subject. He has a particular view on it, and he says if people are going to uncover their heads today, they're going to uncover other parts of their body tomorrow. But that shouldn't drive our exegesis of the text. What the text says has to stand irrespective of which particular cultural milieu we're in. If, for example, you were in a conservative Muslim country where women cover themselves completely from head to toe in burqas, and you are preaching this passage, you'd hope that your exegesis of the text itself would not thereby be affected, by contrast with living in a more promiscuous and immodest Western culture. But there's another kind of reactionariness. There's the reactionariness against that kind of reaction. There's a kind of insecurity that is sometimes manifested by people who are anxious that our church shouldn't be gripped by the, I think, slightly hysterical reaction against cultural decline, which thinks of pastoral responses as though they're a kind of pendulum. The culture has gone The culture has gone that way, and we need to go back this way. And some people are concerned that, frankly, some of the misogynistic and clumsily masculine, quote unquote, portrayals of Christian piety that pervade the Reformed world at the moment, we mustn't have those here. And head covering is seen as a symptom of that, and therefore head covering is resisted very fiercely from a different kind of reactionary standpoint. That's equally foolish. What we need to do is to find a way of looking at the text. And it turns out that the text isn't as simple and clear to understand as we might wish it were. It always blows my mind, actually, when people... Well, okay, I don't want to be harsh. It's understandable, okay? It's completely understandable that somebody would look at this text and say, well, I mean, doesn't it just say that every man who prays or prophesied with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head? It's as though her head was shaven. Well, having shaved head would be kind of dishonorable or disgraceful for a woman. Paul goes on to say that in the next verse. So be much better to cover my head with something, a veil or a hat or something like that. And even if I'm not sure I understand all the details of the passage, I want to play it safe. And I think a lot of people, in fact, my understanding is just from some of the conversations I've been part of in recent days and overheard in recent days, there's a number of ladies who want to say, well, it just kind of looks obvious to me. I want to say, God bless you, if in a sense, if you've just read this passage and thought, well, it just seems to tell me I should cover my head, and that's why you're doing it. I don't want to say you're doing something wrong in the way that you're motivated to obey Scripture. If all of us just heard the voice of the Scriptures and then just did what it said, the world would be a better place. I do, though, want to call attention to the fact that it's not as simple as a superficial reading might appear. Now, this is not intended at all to undermine anybody's convictions, but just to illustrate the fact that sometimes things that look simple at a first glance aren't so simple. We all know things like that, by the way, don't we? We're all aware of situations that we look from the outside and it's like, well, that looks fairly straightforward. What could be difficult about landing a plane? I mean, just, get it flying horizontal about the right moment and slow down. How hard could it be? Well, there you are. There's an example. Something that looks straightforward and isn't. Well, verse 5, for example. Every woman, probably in the context wife, who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered, dishonors her head. Well, prays or prophesies. Many people who read this text just skim straight over that phrase and assume it to be synonymous with public worship. And so they read it as any woman who attends public worship with her head uncovered, etc. Well, let's just be clear, that's not what the text says. It says prays or prophesies. The word prophesy is used in 1 Corinthians in chapter 14, probably in relation to some kind of spirit-endowed charismatic gift, but if not that, certainly in relation to speaking in a way where other people are hearing you. It's something that not everybody in the gathering is doing, but only the person who is speaking. So all the participants in the gathering are not prophesying at that point, and therefore what that would seem to suggest is that a woman, if she's going to do that, and you start to see the complexity now, there are other texts which bear upon the question of whether she should be doing that. But if a woman were to be doing that in first century Corinth, then she should cover her head. But that says nothing about whether she should do it the rest of the time. It certainly doesn't mandate wearing a head covering to come into the church. That's not what it's talking about. The word praise is also used in a similar context, but elsewhere it's also used of prayer in other situations. For example, 1 Corinthians 7, I think it's verse 5, a man and a husband and wife ought not to deprive each other sexually except for a time so that they may devote themselves to prayer. It's the noun form of what here is a verb. And prayer there isn't about just public worship at all. It's about praying in other contexts. So does that mean that what Paul is talking about here is, ladies, you should only wear a head covering if you speak publicly in a worship service, prophesy? Or, ladies, you should wear a head covering even in private prayer, like if you're praying at the meal table, or if you're praying in the car driving along and somebody cuts you up on 820 as you're trying to drive around, come to church. That's what the words refer to. One example of the complexity here. In fact, it gets even more complex than that. I'll give you one more example, verse 10. I'll read from the ESV, then I'll tell you what the text actually says. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Well, let's leave the because of the angels aside for a second. That's another complexity that we might deal with. It may come as a surprise to you that the text that Paul wrote did not have the word, which is here translated a symbol of, in the text. It just says, and this is paraphrasing, only slightly reordering the words, that's why a woman ought to have authority on her head. It doesn't say a symbol of at all. It blows my mind. I was reading one book that defends and argues strongly in favour of the practice of head coverings, written quite recently by a Reformed pastor who claimed to have, it was actually slightly first-year seminary student style writing. He claims to have diagrammed and studied the Greek text, which is a very kind of slightly embarrassing thing to read somebody writing in a book. Anyway, claimed to have done that, when patently he'd not done so, at least not with enough care to notice that the word symbol is absent from verse 10, because when he comments on the text, he doesn't even notice that, or doesn't appear to. In fact, if you just read the old King Jimmy, the King James translation of the Bible, you'd notice that the words a symbol are in italics, which is how the King James translators identified where they're interpolating words which don't have a Greek equivalent, so-called, slight misnomer, but there's nothing in the Greek text explicitly to indicate that those words should be there. They're being interpolated to try and make sense of the text. Reasonable thing to do. Maybe what Paul has in mind is some symbol of authority, but he doesn't use the word, not in verse 10 anyway. And now, why do I mention all this? I mention it to highlight the complexity of the issue, not to beat you up if you've made a judgment on it, but just to highlight that a lot of the time we can be right by accident, often wrong by accident, and I hope the effect of just those two examples will be, among other things, for all of us to hold to our views, whatever they are, lightly enough that when we get to verse 16, it's not difficult for us to avoid being contentious, as Paul says we should. Okay, so I want to deal just with one, maybe two more issues. The first is I want to try and give some kind of explanation or account of how it is that Christians reach diametrically opposite readings of not just this scripture, but other parts of the scripture. By trying to understand what happens when ordinary, faithful, godly, well-intentioned, thoughtful, God-honoring believers read their Bibles. What happens? Well, what happens is that we get most of the main things right most of the time, because Scripture is certainly sufficiently clear that the church as a community is able to understand it, and the perspicuity of Scripture, that is the clarity of Scripture, is sufficient that even a thoughtful solo Christian sitting on a desert island, though they won't get everything right, will get enough right to get saved. It's not difficult in that sense. But what will tend to happen is that Christians who just sit down and read the Bible and conscientiously try and make sense of it will make some predictable mistakes. All of us will do this. And it's worth trying to figure out what those mistakes will be and how we might be held back from them in particular kinds of contexts. So, for example, one of the first things that we'll run into is kind of vivid poetic language. And if we're not a little bit careful, we might get a bit stuck on that and make some fairly predictable mistakes. I was reading Song of Solomon this morning. It's my kind of personal Bible reading. I read the first couple of chapters, and I jump around and read different parts of the Bible. I was reading the first two chapters of Song of Songs. Sustain me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am sick with love. There we are. Well, there's some poetic writing. And the reason that we're held back from making mistakes most of the time with writing like that is that we kind of recognize it as poetic. But be aware that some people don't. I mean, some people, historically, there have been a very, very small number of people who've read the Bible so woodenly that they've not even noticed that the poetic texts are what they are. Other kind of mistakes that people make will make mistakes which arise from a lack of philosophical or theological training. This is particularly the case with complex issues concerning the doctrine of the Trinity or the doctrine of God or the doctrine of the Incarnation. It's very hard to build a systematic theology of the Incarnation. It's why it took the church several hundred years to get close to it. Just by reading the Bible on the surface, you can get most of the ingredients and you can figure out most of the mistakes, but it's very hard to build a positive structure that's really watertight. Sometimes, when thoughtful, godly, conscientious, well-intentioned, Christ-honoring Christians read the Bible, they make mistakes that arise from not being aware of the salvation historical context of what they're reading is. And so a classic example of this would be dispensationalism. One way of understanding dispensationalism is it arises from an extreme literalism in reading Old Testament scripture, which betrays a lack of awareness of the salvation historical context of prophecies about Israel and Jerusalem and the renewal of the sacrifices and so on and so forth. And so what you need in order to deal with that is a better awareness of where you are in salvation history and covenant theology and how the story of the Bible fits together. A more subtle form of the same mistake, or a related mistake, arises with some New Testament texts where some readers are insufficiently aware of the significance of the first century salvation historic context. I have friends in England. I promise you I have friends in England. No, I promise you I have friends in England. I promise you I have friends in England who were, as younger Christians, convinced that Scripture urged them not to marry on the basis of 1 Corinthians 7. It's good for a man not to touch a woman. And in some translations, that's even translated not to marry, which is, well, let's not go there. But anyway, it is. And some people just took that text and ran with it. They were well-intentioned, godly, thoughtful Christians. What they lacked in that case was an awareness of the first century salvation historic context with the approaching judgment on Jerusalem in AD 70 and the significance of that, not just theologically, but also the pastoral and practical significance of it, as Jesus himself remarks in Mark 13 and parallels. It would be terrible for pregnant women in those days. So not a great time to get married if there's any way to avoid that wisely. Also, but my friends lacked an adequate awareness of what the rest of the Bible teaches about marriage and how to slot 1 Corinthians 7 into that framework. So there are a whole bunch of different ways in which we can make fairly predictable mistakes in our misreading of, or reading or misreading of the Bible because of interpretive tools that we don't have readily to hand. There's one other cluster of interpretive tools we might need, and that's an awareness of first century cultural norms, which may or may not bear on questions like head coverings or holy kissing, for example. But what happens when Christians arrive at 1 Corinthians 11 without realizing it? Here's a key thing. Without realizing it, we're running into a text where the correct interpretation of it is actually going to rely on a number of those different elements, an awareness of symbolic significance of different actions and objects in the text, Old Testament background, perhaps some knowledge of the original languages, maybe some cultural issues. You're running into a text where to interpret it rightly requires some awareness of those issues, but it's not obvious to the conscientious, thoughtful reader of the text that that's what's required. And therefore we leap to the conclusion, as many of you have done, no, that's an exaggeration, retract that, as some people have done, that, this is really straightforward, because verse 5, and I want to suggest, you may be right, you may not be right, but straightforward, it's not. One final thought. I want to talk about the place of the Christian conscience in relation to this issue. Should a Christian obey their conscience on this matter? If a Christian is conscientiously convinced that it's right for them to cover their head in worship, irrespective of what I've said this week or may say next week or the week after, should they do so? The answer is yes, and. The Christian's duty in relation to the conscience is twofold. First, we must obey our conscience. The reason is that what conscience is our faculty of moral discrimination. So to obey our conscience is perfectly synonymous with to do what we think is right. And if we're seeking to be informed by Scripture on a particular issue, then what we think is right is what we think God requires of us. Therefore, should we do what we think God requires of us? Well, obviously, yes. Tautologically, yes. We ought to do what we believe Scripture commands. That is to say, we should obey our conscience. But that is only the first half or portion of our duty towards our conscience, or in respect of our conscience. We must obey our conscience. We must also seek to educate our conscience. That is to say, we must seek to become more accurate, faithful, scriptural, wise in our discrimination in relation to what God requires of us. And that may require us to change our mind. In the meantime, what is absolutely certain to happen is that we will not have unanimity on many things. There will be many subjects on which Christians continue to disagree. And I pray that at All Saints we will be able to continue to disagree cheerfully and charitably and graciously and lovingly and thoughtfully on this subject, even while we seek together to educate our consciences on the subject, so that perhaps over time we may grow into greater unanimity and, if we're right, therefore conformity to the will of the living God. Managed to keep that reasonably short, 25 minutes. That at least was part of my goal for today. I will, Lord willing, come back and talk about this another time, maybe next week, and actually jump into the text and highlight not just some of the questions and puzzles and things that make it difficult, but some of the answers, or at least some of the possibilities regarding the answers. But for now, thanks for tuning in. God bless, and bye for now.